We are just about 3 weeks away from college football on that Thursday night, with the Big 12 getting into the mix, with TCU returning a trip to Minnesota to take on the Big Ten's Golden Gophers. We talk some Big 12 football with Jimmy Chavez of Scout.com and Fog.net. Jimmy, thanks so much for joining us.
Mark, great to be with you. Just about time for the best time of the year, hands down. Of course, that's just my opinion, but most people that watch these probably would agree.
And not just that, it's probably the most rabid fan base of any American sport. And then you place on top of that the longest wait between seasons, when you have to go from early January all the way to the end of August to wait for football. It's a long drought. So ready to get underway here in about 3 weeks. Let's talk about the Big 12 finding itself in a predicament last season with Baylor and TCU tying for the Big 12 championship in some people's eyes, or TCU being the better team in most people's eyes, but Baylor winning the head-to-head. So there's an issue with lack of a championship game, not playing on the big stage that weekend, although there were some very important games, including Baylor and Kansas State on that weekend, and also possibly the emergence of Notre Dame, a preseason top 10. We'll see how the Irish fare. And obviously, the one that really gets me is that the math doesn't work. So we shouldn't be surprised that this whole playoff system doesn't work, because you got 4 slots and you've got 5 major conferences. So what can the Big 12 do to help itself?
I feel last time I was on, we were talking about the playoff and kind of the whole system. And, eventually they probably will end up expanding a little bit because of that. But as far as the Big 12, honestly, Mark, what they can do is just win. That's all you have to do. However, you bring up a great point in the fact that there is no championship game. There's 2 schools of thought there. When they had a Big 12 championship, it could help, obviously, but we also saw instances where it hurt them. In '96, Nebraska lost to Texas. Nebraska and their fans, they had their tickets punched up for New Orleans in the Sugar Bowl. They thought they were going to get to play for another national championship, which at the time would have been 3rd straight. They lose to Texas, a 7-4 team going into that game, derailed that. '98, Kansas State loses to Texas A&M. 2001, Texas loses to Colorado. And in '09, Texas nearly lost to Nebraska. And if you ask some Husker fans, they should have lost, and that 1 second should have elapsed and time should have run out. So while it could hurt you, it could also help you, because you're right, that last weekend of the year, everybody's watching. Look at the SEC championship over the year. That's big time stuff. The Big Ten championships become a huge deal, especially with the emergence of Ohio State, Michigan State. You'll see Michigan come back eventually with Jim Harbaugh. So that's going to be a great deal for them. For the Big 12, yeah, they can have some marquee matchups that last weekend, but it's not set in stone. We don't know. If a dark horse team emerges and maybe they're not playing that weekend, it's possible. So what the Big 12 has to do, they've kind of closed their margin for error more than most of the other leagues, because you saw Ohio State get in easily with 1 loss. But hey, nobody's arguing what they did, because when they got in the playoff, they proved it. They beat the teams on the field, and they beat 2 of the best teams in college football a year ago. For the Big 12, though, somebody's got to go undefeated. I think if we have a 1-loss situation, unless it's, say, Texas or Oklahoma, and that's just the way it is, that team's probably not going to get in. If I was to say one team might have a chance as a 1-loss team, I'd still argue TCU. I think the nation really took notice of what they did in that Peach Bowl game last year. And Baylor didn't help their cause by losing to Michigan State, and also kind of grumbling quite a bit in the weeks leading up to that, which made them look like maybe they were being sort of sore losers about the whole deal. They were a little more vocal. Gary Patterson's squad decided, we're not going to be vocal. We're just going to go show you on the field. And they did that. Easiest answer, you got to win. And I think a 12-0 team, they wouldn't get left out, at least of a Power 5 conference in this day and age. Great point about the Notre Dame thing, though. That could be a whole monkey in the wrench that gets thrown in there. We haven't seen it yet, but we saw Notre Dame appear in the national championship game a few years ago. So they very well could end up getting in the mix and kind of wreaking havoc on the system.
Yeah, Jimmy, I completely agree with your analysis on a championship game. Does it help or it hurt? I hear a lot of people out there that take one particular side. Well, it's much more complex than that. It depends on the scenario, the situation. It depends on what would have happened in that championship game, because, as you note, there was a clear-cut championship favor given to Ohio State last season by beating Wisconsin. If they don't play that game and they wind up with a final game win over a marginal Michigan team, they don't make the college football playoff. They stepped up their game, and they provided one more marquee moment for the playoff committee to review. But we've seen, as you reviewed in Big 12 history, and the same thing could be mentioned in SEC history, where a team has been knocked out of the national championship game for playing a conference championship game. The Big 10, the Pac-12, those championship games a little bit too new to have that history, but it certainly happened in the Big 12 and in the SEC. Don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm feeling that you would have selected either Baylor or TCU. So my 2 points before we, again, jump forward to 2015 is, who would you have selected? And would you have selected one of those two teams over? I'm not even going to leave out Ohio State. I don't know why Ohio State's selected as the fourth team. I don't know why Oregon and Alabama weren't given the same analysis with one loss, but I'll throw it out there. Who's the better team out of TCU and Baylor from last year? And then we'll put that argument to rest. And then also the selection versus Ohio State, and I'll include Oregon and Alabama with one loss.
Ironically, you mentioned the three teams, and those three teams I think did belong in the playoff. Florida State, but they were undefeated. So if you're undefeated, a win is a win and is a win. You deserve to be in there. But I would have put TCU ahead of Florida State, but because Florida State was undefeated, you can't do that. So no, I wouldn't have actually included either one of those teams because I would not have bumped Florida State. They were the national champions at Jameis Winston. It's a well-coached team, a good football team, and they deserve to get the opportunity to defend their crown given the way the system works. And eventually things kind of settled out as you thought it would, and that Oregon demolished them in the Rose Bowl. As far as Alabama, I thought Alabama was a great football team, and Ohio State with Urban Meyer, it was no fluke what they did. I think they belong there. So no, I actually wouldn't have included either one of the teams. But if you were to say, okay, pick one of those teams to pick, I would have leaned towards TCU, but then you get into the argument Baylor won the head-to-head matchup. We saw this happen in 2008. Texas beat Oklahoma, but Oklahoma, because of a three-way tie with Texas and Texas Tech, ended up in the Big 12 championship. They destroyed Missouri 62-21, end up going to the national championship. Texas felt they had a right to appear in that game because they beat OU on the field, and the Sooners lost a close one to Tim Tebow in Florida. So there's no easy answer to that. So if you're asking, well, would I have done anything differently? No, I would have left it as it is, and it worked out on the field.
And the Big 12 did itself a complete disservice by not determining a champion. I can't believe that once the conference was reduced to 10 teams and the championship game was no more, that there wasn't anything written into the legislation about how to determine a champion. You can't tell me that. I think they were trying to outwit the College Football Playoff Committee to determine, okay, who's the more favored team by them. Is it Baylor? Is it TCU? Baylor won the head-to-head, but TCU is impressing more people and has a little bit tougher of a schedule. So I think they were outwitting themselves in regards to waffling on the championship determination there in the Big 12. Also, I would have to say this, Jimmy. The Big 12, unfortunately, last season played poorly against out-of-conference competition, and the performance of the last few seasons hasn't been good. So the bowl matchups have to be won. Of course, they can't be won before a playoff's determined, but the big matchups in the preseason need to be won, as you mentioned right off the top. Unfortunately for the conference, there aren't too many of those. So off the top of my head, TCU plays Minnesota. Are they going to give credit for beating Minnesota? Well, it depends on how good the Golden Gophers are. If they're an expected 8-4, 7-5 kind of team, well, they're going to be given marginal credit for winning that game. Minnesota obviously playing in the Big 10, plays in Ohio State. I don't know if they play Michigan State off the top of my head, so there's that comparison as there was last season. Baylor, I jump on them, and half of the last couple of years, they're no longer the Baylor of the 1990s. They have to schedule out of conference. They haven't done that. They need to play some heavyweights.
Look at play this.
Texas always goes out and plays teams. For Oklahoma, it's the Tennessee matchup, and Tennessee should be better this year. Have they taken a huge jump? We'll wait and see. And I believe, off the top of my head, that Kansas State, after playing Auburn in a really good matchup last year, doesn't play anyone this year.
And that was a Ron Prince scheduled matchup that eventually had to be returned because they played in 07. Bill Snyder, no way in the world would he ever schedule anyone like Auburn. He believes in scheduling the cupcakes for the first three games to get those 3 wins and get some confidence in the team. You talk about Baylor. Look at their non-con this year. At SMU, Lamar and Rice. That's not going to get it done. And I'm sorry if you want to complain and say, okay, well, we deserve a shot. Well, you didn't play anybody in the non-conference. You did that to yourself. No one's going to feel sorry for you. Texas goes and plays Notre Dame. We started by talking about how Notre Dame could be a player in the national scene this year. It's a new day and age. I mean, Jim Delaney just had a deal passed for the Big Ten that they're going to have to play quality opponents in the non-conference. No more FCS opponents, nothing like that. He doesn't want that to ever happen to the Big Ten, and I applaud what they're doing. It's the new day and age in college football. Listen, if you want to be one of the big boys and you want to be in that playoff in the end, you have to go earn it. You can't just say, okay, well, we can sneak by the first 3 games and hope our conference does it. You have to go play some opponents that are going to be a challenge for you, because if you're really that good, you'll win one of those games.
Definitely, and that's where I'm going to credit Texas. I know they've been down for a long time, but if you look around the country, most really big-time teams schedule one Power 5 heavy opponent. Texas usually schedules a couple. They've scheduled Ole Miss and UCLA in recent years, Notre Dame. They're always going out there scheduling games, and they've been down since 2009. So let's bring it back inside the conference, Jimmy, and let's look at Baylor and TCU. They are the 2 clear favorites in this race. Oklahoma and, of course, Texas, for now quite some time, have slid back. We definitely have a power flip. Baylor, TCU, the Big 2, and the Little 8 versus what's always been Texas and Oklahoma traditionally.
This would have been we would be having the same conversation 30 years ago if we were talking about the Southwest Conference and being like, hey, TCU and Baylor are the 2 favorites to contend to go to the Cotton Bowl. So it's no different now than it would have been then. It's the same principles here. You have a day, like I said, we do live in a day and age where TCU and Baylor are the 2 powers in the Big 12. I don't think they're a fluke at all. I think Gary Patterson and Art Briles are 2 of the finest coaches in college football. Think about what Art Briles has done. Baylor was one of the laughing stocks in all of college football. Everyone's homecoming opponent. Art Briles comes in there, and with Robert Griffin III together, they turned it around. Baylor is just they're a sight to see when you see the way they do things. Baylor is cool now. It's a much different deal down in the state of Texas. There are recruits who will choose to go to Baylor over Texas or Texas A&M. That was unthinkable. I grew up down there. I mean, you're talking 15 years ago. No one thought of Baylor as anything like that. However, that being said, I don't think it is a permanent deal. No, I'm not talking about the 2 programs. I think they'll be around as long as those 2 coaches are there. But as far as Texas and Oklahoma, they're coming back. I do really believe it, and you talked about it as well. Oklahoma is a lot closer than people think. They're going to a new offense, going back to an air raid. It's designed to really put some pressure. It's what everyone's doing. It's up-tempo. It's a lot of fun with the hiring of Lincoln Riley. If they're able to score points like they have some good players on defense, they could surprise some people, and suddenly Oklahoma, TCU has to go to Norman. Oklahoma has to play at Baylor. What happens if OU wins both those games? Now we're talking a whole different scenario. So while, yes, TCU and Baylor are the 2 favorites in the league, and well-deserved, and it is an amazing thing to say just out loud to believe it, Oklahoma's not really going that far away. Texas might be another year away under Charlie Strong, but if you look at his pedigree and his history, odds are he's probably going to get that program turned around, and we'll see right away how they look when they play Notre Dame to start the season. And then other teams in the league. What about Oklahoma State? Does Mike Gundy get that thing rolling again? They won the league a few years ago. It's a lot tighter than people think. And plus, it is a round robin. Well, not a round robin. I mean, that's the thing in basketball. But everybody plays everybody. You have 9 conference games. So they could end up beating up on each other. And that could also derail anyone playing for a national championship and getting into that playoff out of the Big 12.
So you bring up a great point there. I love this point about it being a true championship, and I argue with people about this all the time because most people take the side of the other conferences having legitimate champions because they play a championship game. My argument is that in the Big 12, we don't have to analyze schedules and say, oh, who missed who, 14-team conferences playing 8 conference games. That means and Ohio State and Alabama didn't play 5 teams in that particular conference. In their own conference, missed 5 out of 14 teams or 13 other teams. I think that's crazy. There is a true champion. I'm analyzing schedules right now. I've gone through the ACC, completed the ACC, and you've got Clemson and Florida State, by far the 2 most dominant programs in the conference, although Georgia Tech jumped up for a season last year. Those are the two dominant programs. Well, you've got a Miami, for example, that has to play Clemson and Florida State. And then you've got another team in its own division, Miami's own division, that plays Wake and Syracuse. That's a monumental advantage or disadvantage when you're only playing 8 conference games and you play 6 alike within the division, but the other 2 are played against top 10 teams versus somebody else playing very, very marginal teams, 2 and 3 and 4 win teams. That decides a division right there. While the Big 12, we don't have to argue about that. Everybody played everybody. There it is. It's a true championship, in my opinion.
Right, and it's the way college football used to be. You know, people, they're going to be kids that grow up, they're like, wait, the Pac-10 used to be 10 teams. Well, it also used to be 8, but you used to have the Big 8 play everybody. Southwest
Right.
Conference play. The Big 10 used to be 10 teams. I can remember that. It's been a long time. The SEC, I mean, everyone used to play everyone. And so you never had these arguments. I mean, you had arguments over, well, what if 1 and 2 don't meet in the postseason? That's been replaced by, you know, we have these super conferences, and who knows where it goes? Who knows who's the first to go to 16 teams? Who knows if we one day have just 4 16-team conferences? I mean, it is a new day in college athletics and in college football. And the Big 12 is one of the few that are doing it kind of the archaic way by circumstance, by the fact that they had 4 teams league and they leave the conference and they replaced them with 2. But it is what it is, and it creates at least some drama in that these teams do beat up on each other. And if the Big 12 were to have a year where 6 or 7 teams were very, very strong, that makes for some great drama. It becomes a de facto playoff to decide who goes to a playoff. It also could be a war of attrition in which teams don't make it out without 2 losses. That's very possible as well. So it just depends on which side of the fence you live on. Do you think it's a good thing? Do you think it's a bad thing? Or if you're just a football fan, it's entertaining, but it all depends on how good the league is. And honestly, it's been kind of down the past 4 or 5 years, and it was maybe even down a year or 2 before, unless you go back maybe towards 2008. But then you were talking about the divisions. You had 3 of the powerful teams in all of college football in one division, and not really much in the North Division, and that you had Texas, Oklahoma, and Texas Tech, and there was controversy in that. So I don't know. It goes back to something we've always talked about. Maybe there is no clear-cut way to win, and that you just sit back and enjoy it.
You can do that, but that gives us nothing to do, Jimmy. We need something to argue about. So
Oh, and I love it. So I'm fine with that. I'm okay with that.
okay, so I'm going to hit you with one last question, and that's concerning the TCU Baylor lock, or what appears to be a lock on the Big 12, and that game deciding everything versus a possible dark horse jumping up. And I love your point about Oklahoma, and we talked about it before we came on. People are so locked into what happened last week and so reactionary to what happened last week, and then in the offseason, it's what happened last season, and that's the only thing that counts, and that's the end of the perception. Oklahoma, as we were sitting here this time last year, had just beaten Alabama in the Sugar Bowl, which was considered the best team in the country and was a top 5 finisher from the previous season. They haven't dropped that much. Yes, I think they have issues. I think they're clearly a step behind the other 2, but things break different in college football. Things can happen. And so I would love your feelings about the rest of the race, and if somebody could possibly jump up and challenge the other 2.
I like Oklahoma. I mean, we forget they lost a couple. Most notably, they lost to Kansas State because their really solid kicker couldn't make an extra point and missed a couple short field goals. What if they win that game? The TCU game, if I remember correctly, wasn't really much of a blowout. Baylor did blow them out down there. And then the Oklahoma State game, they had one and they blew that. They go to the bowl game. They lay as big an egg as a Bob Stoops team has in his tenure, and considering the bowl game and the opponent and just the way things were going. So they end up finishing 8-5, and it's just doom and gloom down there. But it can be so fickle. What if a couple of things go differently and they end up, say, 11-2? I think that's what they did the year before when they beat Alabama in the Sugar Bowl. Oklahoma still has a lot of talent. They have some young talent. They have a guy who ran for 400 and something yards last year and set an NCAA record. That's pretty good as well. So I don't think they're that far away. Now, here's a scenario, Mark. What if Oklahoma gets TCU at home and they beat them? What if they go down to Baylor and they win that game? A lot of things could end up happening. Also, it's not a lock that Baylor or TCU are going to go undefeated. TCU has to go to Kansas State. Baylor plays on a Thursday night at Kansas State. If there's one thing that anyone who's followed the Big 8 or the Big 12 over the course of the past 25 years has learned, you never, ever underestimate and count out a Bill Snyder coach team, because they'll just lay there in the woods and everyone could say, oh, they're going to be 6-6, and they end up going 10-2. Their conference championship team in 2012, people had them pick 5th and 6th in the league, in a 10-team league, and they came close to playing for a national championship if they don't lose at Baylor late in the year, and they end up having a great season. They lose in the Fiesta Bowl to Oregon, but you can't count them out. So the fact that Kansas State hosts both of those games, it would be foolish to say, oh, well, TCU and Baylor are just going to run the table and they're going to play that game at the end of the year 11-0. It could be 9-2 versus 9-2, which would still be a pretty darn good football game. But that answers the first question you asked, and suddenly they're not going to a playoff. They're playing for a league championship possibly, but has nothing to do with the playoff. That's the way it is. Keep an eye out on Oklahoma. That would be the one. If you're the dark horse itself, the challenge for the league crown would say Oklahoma. And let's see what Texas looks like. Let's see what Oklahoma State looks like. If those teams are better, they're going to challenge the teams at the top. Now suddenly TCU and Baylor don't have as much of a cakewalk as some may have thought going into the season.
Jimmy Chavez,
and you're not going to avoid anybody either.
Pardon me, Jimmy?
And you're not going to avoid anyone either, because everyone will play everyone. So we're going to find out on the field.
That's right. That's the beauty of the situation. A true champion in the Big 12. Jimmy Chavez joining us from scout.com and also fog.net. I'm very intrigued by the Big 12 race, despite the apparent stronghold of the Big 2 in Baylor and TCU, with Oklahoma possibly jumping up. And a lot of people like Oklahoma State as a dark horse as well. Unfortunately, again, Jimmy, I end this on a downer, because I would love to see more matchups like Michigan State, Oregon, Alabama, Wisconsin, some things that we're going to see, some matchups we're going to see in the other Power 5 conferences that we don't see unless Tennessee proves to be a much better team than we anticipate at this point as a fringe top 25. And if they're a factor in the SEC and Oklahoma wins that battle in Knoxville in week 3, then Oklahoma plays well in the Big 12. Then we finally have something to compare those teams against the other Power 5. Jimmy, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Mark, always a pleasure. Great to be on with you.